Charles, very difficult for the British public. We have a Prime Minister one week talking about China as a threat. We have a Prime Minister now who thought it was a threat and thought that it wasn't. Do we actually have any policy, plan or strategy as to how to deal with China?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, let's just start with whether it's a threat or not. I mean, I don't think it's necessarily a good idea for prime ministers to bandy labels around that, or even prospective prime ministers.
Well, both did.
And both did. But I mean, everybody knows that China's a threat. It's not necessary for the prime minister to say so. But, you know, the head of MI6, the head of MI5 and various others have said so quite loudly. So that's the way it is, and we shouldn't be too loud in our saying of that, unless it's a matter where it really is beyond the pale. I mean, like in Xinjiang and it really is. I mean, it's been labelled genocide, but it's certainly crimes against humanity. Then I think it's right for prime ministers to make a noise about it.
Yeah.
But when you
what about just one moment, sorry to interrupt you. What about Hong Kong?
Well, and Hong Kong too.
I mean, we did a deal and they've broken the deal.
Yeah. I mean, these are important issues. When you go against international law, you break international law, you're undermining the whole system in which nations get on together. So that's a very serious matter, and it should be called out. But I think that's the point. It's individual policies and actions that should be called out loudly. But just labelling people a threat, I mean, we all know that, but it just annoys. But of course, you rightly ask, well, OK, but then do we have a strategy? Now, if you go across into Whitehall and ask people, they'll say, yes, we've got a strategy. And you say, well, what is it exactly? And it's, I have to say, not particularly clear. And if you go back even over 3 years, the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Commons called for a government strategy. And I think it is really important because if they've got one and nobody knows that they've got one, what use is that? And if it's confidential and classified, well, most of government won't be allowed to read it because most of government isn't vetted. And of course, all of government has to know how to deal with China in the same way. And so does business need to know what the attitude, and so does academia, and so does civil society. So I think it's absolutely right to call loudly for a strategy. Yes, they've been a little bit preoccupied with other matters over the last few years, what with COVID and problems inside the Conservative Party.
Is that really an excuse?
I don't think it's a sufficient excuse. I mean, I think we really do need a clear guidance on where we are with China. And I don't think that, from what I know, the government has really been putting enough time and energy into that. So one hopes that it
and Sunak himself clearly all over the place on this issue.
Well, I mean, it's not an easy issue because you have things like national security, which and data privacy, and our values, all of which are under threat. But at the same time, there's a great interdependence with China, in trade and in investment in global goods like climate change and even in things like epidemics, pandemics, where perhaps the cooperation has not been ideal.
No.
So it's not something that you could, as you did in the old days of the Cold War, just turn your back on it and say, well, Russia, we're not doing anything with you. You have to deal with China. So getting that balance right